your host, Nathan. I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, good to see you. Nice chatting with you. What's going on? What's happened this week?
Good to see you too. It's been an interesting week, exciting week, getting ready for this trip to New York for the inquiry into anomalous phenomena and the phenomenon. Did I say that right?
I think that's
Anomalous experiences and the phenomenon. That's what
Yes,
it
there
is.
it
Yeah.
is.
Coming up in New York this next weekend. So that's going to be exciting just to meet all these people that we kind of talk to virtually in social media and whatnot, to be able to meet not only some of them, but a whole bunch of them all in one go. I mean, the number of people who said, "Hey, I'm looking forward to meeting you in New York." I'm like, wow, I'm going to be like everywhere I turn, there's going to be someone to meet. So it's going to be an intense, impacting, and I'm sure transformative week for those of us who are going to attend in person.
Yeah, I'm incredibly excited for that. I'm very bummed out that I can't be there. I will be there in spirit, no doubt, and I'll be there virtually. I'll be watching along from home on that virtual feed. By the time folks are hearing this episode, the lectures will basically be over. I think you're slotted for the 4 p.m. time slot roughly on Saturday, and this usually comes out in the evening. So hopefully, those of you who are listening in, you've had a full day of UAP phenomena conversation, and some of you may have even gotten a chance to meet Darren in person, which I hope so, and you'll get to experience the wonderful person that he is in the flesh. Well, this episode is going to be interesting. We've talked about this one for a few sessions now, our kind of private sessions as we plan out our episodes and things we want to get to and territory we want to cover. And this one, I think, felt like a very natural topic, and that is looking back on where we started in this journey and kind of where we are right now. And it's interesting, too, that we're actually having this conversation today. This is the day before Yom Kippur. Neither of us come from a Jewish tradition, but that is a holiday that is often sort of connoted with a day of reflection and looking back and, taking stock. And so this feels very natural to be doing that. Well, as we kind of go through that exercise, I think we're going to start with a very familiar place that most folks who are listening probably can identify with. You probably all, or many of you, started in this place as well. Although I know there are also many who have been on this journey for decades, and we're grateful for your listenership as well. But what I'm speaking about specifically is, Exos, we kind of look back over the last few years with the initiatives of To the Stars and Tom DeLonge, Chris Mellon, Lou Elizondo, Jim Semivan, and so many others. Looking back, it's almost been 5 years now. How do you kind of see where that started and kind of what that was trying to do and all of the many conversations that have taken place since then with many of those initial advocates and, where we are right now. And so, and not just in a, here's the facts of progression, but where you are, where you situate yourself in that journey, having reflected on those few years and your own beliefs today about the phenomenon.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because those people you mentioned, a lot of them, even for them, what they think about the phenomenon, what they think is going on, is kind of a combination of personal experience and sort of intel that they've come across somehow. And I think that's something that really I would want to highlight for people is that I sometimes have opportunities to talk to people that people would consider insiders, and I'm always reminded of that people are still people, and that it's not like there's this one group of people that has this shining, pot of gold of intel that's super clear and they know exactly what's going on, and they just unfortunately can't tell people because of their NDAs or something. It's not like that. There's like we are very aware of, there's plenty of data saying something's going on. They're aware of that. They are working to get information out of these siloed, compartmentalized data storehouses, basically, in these different agencies and whatnot. And that's still a challenge. But what I've noticed is even for them, what they conclude about what the phenomenon is likely is still heavily influenced by their own personality, by their own worldview. And that's why you even notice some differences in how they will talk about it. Some being more quote unquote nuts and bolts, some being a bit more, towards the woo side. So that's something I would say is that I still see, and I've mentioned this even on social media, many people, for instance, will hear someone they consider an insider, waxing philosophic about, what we should think about, like when it comes to the phenomenon. And because some of these people have a background in intelligence, they know it's always helpful and useful and wise to open the aperture as much as you can, to ask big questions, to, step outside the box so you make sure you're not missing potential data or insights because you've limited yourself prematurely. So, in trying to encourage that general tendency towards approaching this topic, some people will run with what's being said and said, this is their way of like getting around their NDA, and they're giving us a coded message. And now we need to like just pour into that and figure out what's really going on. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what's being said, what's being encouraged. And I think if there's one thing this phenomenon teaches you, you have to be a curious person who's willing to deal with ambiguity. And for those who are looking for that one nugget that's going to lead them in the right path so they find the storehouse with all the intel about what this actually is, they're going to be sorely disappointed. But there's another group of people, I think you and I fit in this side, that actually love the grand mystery, because this touches every aspect of reality. And I look at this, and I think you do too, more like an adventure where it's personally transformative, it's culturally transformative. It's a really amazing moment in human history, and we get to be a part of it. That feels amazing. That's the way I look at this when I think about the entire thing over the last 5 years and how people tend to interact with these sort of people who started the whole thing back in 2017.
Yeah, that's an excellent summation. I totally identify with the kind of character that you painted there, because but at the same time, I think it didn't take me very long to recognize that what I was doing in listening to those insiders was familiar to me, and I couldn't quite place what that familiarity was. But then it came to me from my religious training and education that oftentimes what we see in the kind of birth of a religious tradition is you see individuals that are several steps removed from the original experiences or the closer firsthand knowledge, and they're doing their best to kind of transcribe their understanding of whatever it is that happened. And it could have happened a generation or two ago. It's sort of this oral tradition that kind of gets passed down. But they're the figureheads, they're the leaders of the movement, and the followers who are eager to know more and want to unlock those secrets. They're hanging on every single word of those leaders to come to certain conclusions and really put it all together. Because in the West in particular, at least this was my upbringing, I had this sense that if I could just put these pieces together, that I would arrive at this place of kind of pure enlightenment, or I would have it figured out. My problems would basically disappear because I would have gained all of this knowledge. The picture would be complete. I think that's exactly what I see happening. And in some ways, I'm glad that we are now where we are, because I personally see, and this is after having talked with a lot of these people myself, having had opportunity to interview them, getting to know some folks who are closer on the inside, the sheen is wearing off on that perspective for me, and they're becoming real people, right? You talked about this. They're just real people. And some of them do a very good job, I think, of trying to tell you that, although I don't think we do a good job of hearing what they are saying. So many of them are very good about saying that this is speculation, and maybe it's informed speculation, but oftentimes it's not. It just comes out of having many, many conversations with others who've had experiences and coming to their own conclusions. And a lot of these folks are incredibly smart and creative, and they're coming up with some novel ideas that are useful in understanding whatever this may be. But to take those musings and to jot them down as some sort of like scientific formula, that if we just put these variables in the right places, like we'll unlock the secret potion, like that's not really how it is. And I, more and more I've come to this place of understanding and even quite frankly peace with this, that we don't have a lot of the answers, that those who are inside in many of these programs, they do have insight, they do know secrets. I'm not saying that they don't, but in terms of the entirety of the picture of what's really going on, I'm not sure that they really have that clearness that we think that they do. And the more that we, I think, dispense with that notion, the better off we'll be, which is not to say we shouldn't talk with them and shouldn't try to understand what they understand. But I think it is to try to position that knowledge in its appropriate place, not place it on this incredible pedestal that, even they would not put their understanding on.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think something I recognize that I notice a lot of, especially the nuts and bolts crowd, don't seem to recognize is that, from my perspective, you're more likely to get a clearer sense in a totality kind of way about what's going on by listening to the historic representation of experiencers' testimony. That tells a story about the who, right, and the what. What the a lot of the government sources have is raw data around like sensor systems, some images, some video, that kind of thing. But you still are left with the interpretation of what does that mean? What does that raw intel point towards? And I know that there are certain, segmented parts of these main agencies, for instance, even within NASA, who seek out experiencers because they recognize that that's the missing piece of the puzzle, that NASA can have as much footage as you want, and the astronauts that have gone up, like Ed Mitchell, have talked about stuff they've seen, but that doesn't tell you who it is, right? When they're not communicating with you, when they're just trailing your spacecraft or whatever, or you see them from the moon, that doesn't tell you what their agenda is, who they are, what their background is. But a lot of that has been communicated to experiencers. So I think that's something I would encourage people with, is that data is a lot more valuable than many people still give it credit for. And I would just add, as I always do with my sort of disclaimer here, you can allow for a certain amount of deception, fraud, misidentification, mental illness. You can line all those things up and say a certain segment of that data falls in those categories, right? But you still have, even if you allow for some of that and a fair amount of that, you have a lot of historical data from experiencers experiencing remarkably similar things, even cross-culturally, right? And people who have oftentimes no history with the UFO phenomenon, no interest in it, right? And many of those people wishing this is the last thing that had ever happened to them. So that to me says it's a really compelling data set. And I just wish people would look at that more seriously, because sometimes in focusing on these insiders and these little nuggets that are said in this one podcast interview here or there, they're missing all the commonalities that show up over time in all the experiencer accounts. So spend as much or more time listening to those, pull out patterns within that data set, rather than always trying to find the one nugget from somebody who happened to work for the government.
Absolutely. I think that, people who have been studying this like we have, and those who follow this, pretty regularly, we have a decent grasp on the answer to the question, is this real? I think we can answer that pretty affirmatively. The insiders really help us to get there. The next sort of leg of this journey, if we want to be on the vanguard, or want to be ready to help in where this is going, is to practice speaking with experiencers and listening to experiencers, and they're everywhere. And some of you who are listening may be experiencers. You may have those in your family. Things that we can all do that I think just make us better people generally is practice being a better listener, understanding what people have gone through, and trying to synthesize those different experiences to come to a broader conclusion, and also leaving room for mystery. I would encourage that as well, that we can compile all the experiencer accounts together, and we can do a lot of data analysis on that, and I hope we do. I hope that it does become something that we get better at doing. But at the same time, coming to that grand conclusion is still going to be a little bit of a challenge, because all of those experiences are mediated to us through those individual people's lives, and how they understand the world, and the background that they have, and their own experience. So we have to disentangle that in some ways to really get to those core nuggets of truth. And even then, it will still be challenging. So, that to me is, it feels like that's kind of where we are. I know it doesn't seem like it. It feels like we're still in that season of waiting on, the government to say something profound, but we may be at a place where our reliance on that is not as strong, and we may be at a different place a place we didn't think we would be, which is, beginning to have these conversations with people who are telling us that they have had experiences, and we need to listen to that.
Yeah, and I think while I do think some really exciting things are happening with, for instance, setting up testimony from whistleblowers and things like that to do with black budget legacy UFO programs and that kind of thing, crash retrievals and reverse engineering programs and all that, which we know exist. While all that is exciting, I think that a lot of this will happen from an upswell, from sort of a grassroots kind of movement. And again, one thing, regardless of what the government does or doesn't do, and we say that we're government in quotes because, as we've said many times, it's a complex assortment of different organizations made up of people that are your neighbors from across the board in terms of worldviews and whatnot. But I mean, one thing that does seem clear, and again, I remember there was a recent article in Liberation Times that talked about this. Like the sense that this is exponentially increasing, right? The interaction of the phenomenon or elements of the phenomenon with us, right? And interacting with military groups and also just with people in general seems to be really scaling up. So regardless of what government decides it's going to do or not, in many ways its hand may be forced because this is going to be an upswell in people's experiences, and also just this other, this otherness, right? This other intelligence, at least some elements of it, really ramping up in our experience as a collective society, and that alone might change the perspective or the picture dramatically over the next 6 months to a year.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Hopefully that does happen. Well, let's get kind of into the details then here. So, in looking back and looking at where you are now, what is something that you now believe about the phenomena? Something that feels, quite solid to you, but may not have been on your radar before, or have been very solid to you at all. What's something that really stands top of mind now for you?
Yeah, when we talked about what we might discuss this time on the podcast, once we came up with that question, and I thought about it, it's like, wow, there's a lot of things now that seem very data driven as being historical, actually having happened that I would not have thought was the case before. And I started listing them in my head, and there was quite a few. The first one I would say that's surprising is how much of our 20th century narrative that we were brought up with is incorrect, and not just like missing a point here or there, but significantly incorrect and deliberately misrepresented what really happened. I think that so much of this comes down to people have a certain threshold of what they're willing to believe could have happened or can happen. And sometimes they're not self aware about where that threshold is. And so they just ignore certain data when it pushes past that threshold. And I think sometimes only what will persuade you to reconsider that threshold is just the sheer volume of data that begins to show up that makes you go, okay, I have no choice but to look at this squarely in the eyes because this data keeps showing up. And so, one for me is around certain alien groups actually approaching like American administrations in the past and trying to, like the Eisenhower administration, for instance, and trying to negotiate, exchange of technology and maybe perhaps even moving towards free energy kind of platforms in exchange for disarmament and concerns that these various groups had around atomic weapons that we were developing. 2 years ago, even that would have sounded pretty outlandish to me. I just thought there would be no way that that could have been historical, that actually would have happened, and it would have stayed under wraps. I think even people that have a problem with the notion of like legacy reverse engineering programs, same idea, right? They just think that's too big a secret to keep for this long. It can't be true, right? And that's a compelling point, that generally the bigger the secret and the more people that know it, the harder it is to keep it for very long, right? Because eventually people want to come clean. But, to that point, a lot of the information we have are kind of like your standard deathbed confessions. People who are coming clean, they have nothing to gain at this point, right? They're on their last breath, but they know the government can no longer threaten them, so they come clean. So a lot of that came out of even the Disclosure Project with Stephen Greer and things, some great testimony there that I think is very compelling. I think a lot of people ignore it because it's associated with Stephen Greer, who's kind of become a bit of a tangled mess for some people. But I think people need to be open to seeing what those witnesses are saying, right? Um, but yeah, for me, that was one of them. Was this notion that non-human intelligences actually contacted governments and tried to broker these kind of arrangements for the benefit of humanity. And then, maybe not surprising, the one part that's not so surprising is that actually, for various reasons, those overtures were turned down, declined, because there was concerns about, well, what if the Soviets don't match us in terms of disarmament? So as outlandish as that would have sounded to me 2 years ago, I think there's strong evidence historically that that actually happened. What do you think about that particular point, and what comes up for you in terms of stuff you believe now that you wouldn't have before?
Yeah, well, I mean, on that one specifically, I've always been intrigued by those accounts. Um, I know you've studied that, very closely, and after having many conversations with you about it, I share your conviction that there is more there than not. Um, and I think more broadly, we've talked about this in a great deal. Not only is our story about the 20th century, sort of inaccurate, but our human story is fairly inaccurate. There's a lot in our past that the more you look at it, and we spend a decent chunk of our lives looking at historical beliefs and traditions. The more you go back and look at that material, the more it really does kind of jump out at you. That this interaction has been happening for quite some time, and it's interesting because you would think that you and I, people who have studied that, would have caught on to those connections a lot faster. Um, but in some ways, I think it highlights the degree to which we have these biases and blinders on about those belief systems. We think of them as these locked in place systems and ideas that are kind of just part of the fabric of reality, the air in which we breathe, even if we're not born into those traditions and haven't been, churchgoers or going to synagogue or what have you. We're in America, where we spend most of our time. It's just kind of part of the culture, and these things aren't really challenged. They are taken as givens in many ways. But the more that, at least for me, the more time I have spent outside of those institutions, the clearer that picture has become. So it is easier now for me to look back at the texts of my childhood and go, yeah, I mean, I could overlay this right onto experiencer accounts, abduction accounts, non-human entity engagements, all of these things. And I mean, it's just right there staring me in the face. So, for me, I just want to echo what you're saying and take it even further. And I know you were probably going to jump in with the same perspective, but what do you think about that as well?
Yeah, I mean that this topic leaves no subject unscathed. I would say, it's remarkable how someone can, read an article in the New York Times in 2017 and go, oh, maybe there's something to this idea of like, nuts and bolts, advanced technology, being flown here from Alpha Centauri through a wormhole or something. That sounds exciting. And next thing you know, you follow that rabbit hole until human history and the nature of reality has been undone. I mean, that's where you end up.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable when you think about that. And it can all happen in a fairly short amount of time too. But yeah, I first wanted to point out or, highlight what you said about even when you're in circles that are studying these things, you can be brainwashed into a certain perspective. You can inherit certain assumptions that are so like just part of the milieu that you don't even recognize you're doing it. And so, for instance, for us in our religious history traditions that we learned academically, it's amazing to me now, like you say, when I look back, there's stuff that seems to be staring us in the face, and yet we didn't see it because we weren't being told to keep an eye out for it, and we were inheriting these certain options, like it's A or B. Some people say C, but those are the three options, kind of thing. And so you never think about D, right? You assume that, just like we do with our parents when we're being brought up, that they know what they're talking about, right? That we assume that we are standing on the shoulders of giants who've studied these things for hundreds of years, if not thousands in the case of religious history, and they know what they're talking about. And who are we to question it? So we're more there to inherit a tradition in some ways, right? Inherit a perspective, and inherit a kind of specialist's kind of interpretation of things. So that blows my mind when I think about it now, and even how that happens in other realms of academia as well. That I've been on this a lot about this notion that physicalism is really an untenable kind of model, and yet it's still widespread in academia, and that's not going to change anytime soon. I mean, cracks are beginning to show, but it takes a long time for the very reasons we're talking about. That it's not so much like fresh inquiry as it is an inheritance of perspectives and traditional viewpoints, even when it comes to something like science, right? So that is quite shocking. But yeah, on the piece about human history, I think it's remarkable when I think back to how much that has shifted. Before we went on tonight, you and I were talking about this, and I was saying how when I was studying religious studies, I actually got to learn Hebrew and read, the Old Testament actually in Hebrew, which is amazing. I still remember on the first day of class of my first year in Hebrew, had this prof who showed us, the Pentateuch, and we actually got to look at it, and it looks so alien. Like, for those who haven't seen Hebrew, the characters look nothing like English or any kind of Latin-based language, and you actually read it backwards as well. And things like vowels are like they're designed around the consonants, so you actually have these dots and things that actually tell you things about where the vowels are. So it's a completely alien experience in terms of reading language, right? But what amazes me now is I look back at some of those, like reading those terms in Hebrew as opposed to how, or later translated into English, often several times over, right? And how we were talking about like the term Elohim, which is a plural term, and often in English Bibles that's just like lumped into God. So there's these times where there's these different terms used that we just say, we'll just say God. That works. And what people don't realize is that that's sort of like forcing something onto the text to fit with a certain theological perspective that's really not there in the text itself. And in many ways, you could say it's like a bastardization of the actual text. Like it's not being loyal to the original meaning at all. And then when you take into account that, the Old Testament tradition, is actually based on, so both for Judaism and what later became Christian tradition, is actually based on much older stories, narratives that come out of Babylonian, Akkadian, and Sumerian texts, which talk about these beings, these groups of beings who come and interact with human beings. Suddenly, instead of going and looking at this sort of like, this notion of a spirit realm with God and angels or demons, the ones that fell, you look at it more like these sort of interdimensional beings that are somewhat, maybe you could look at extraterrestrial, somewhat interdimensional. Again, I've said before, I think those terms kind of collapse into something deeper than both of those, transcends both of those. But you could certainly look at it now, and I kind of do look at it now and say, this is kind of staring us in the face that some of the same hybridization programs that people are unwittingly and not being desirous of, but are being lumped into now, that's actually happening to people that I know, right? I know people personally who've been subject to these hybridization programs. Sometimes they're for it, and sometimes it's kind of against their will. Again, because there's numerous groups here. What's amazing to me now is I look at some of these ancient traditions that we studied and never saw any of this. Now I look at it and I say it's staring me in the face that the same groups, some of the same groups that sort of authored human civilization likely and were involved in hybridization programs even then, that same thing is happening today, which of course completely changes the picture about virtually everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, this insight, just to kind of dwell on it a little bit longer, to me is very helpful because there are so many folks in our circles. I don't mean our UFO circles, but our day-to-day lives who come from these traditions and still observe these belief systems. And if you're thinking about having a conversation about your interest in the phenomena, and you get some pushback from folks that are in those kinds of belief systems, to me, like, I think you can begin bridging that divide by just highlighting a lot of the commonalities of belief in the two narratives. We we in Christian belief, we certainly have a lot of text about engaging with non-human intelligences. We have prayer as a type of modality. It's that you could liken pretty similarly in some respects to C5 or Heis. Miracles. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on. There are plenty of touch points here that to the devout, they just seem like, yeah, like that. That's just, I believe that. That's, but when they listen to things about UFOs, they go, oh, that's just, that's some sort of strange sci-fi perspective, that they have this overlay onto that where it seems so foreign. And quite frankly, I even remember growing up where my parents would make, similarly kind of, mildly derogatory comments about other belief systems like Scientology, for example, or Mormonism. These were more recent religious traditions that certainly didn't have the kind of solid foundations that Christianity did, and therefore weren't as valid, of belief. So, to me, like, if you've had enough distance, time, perspective, you can really kind of see all of this from the same lens, and that in and of itself is powerful. That unlocks something of a deeper meaning and truth about what's really been going on in the human story. And to me, as you said earlier, like that's why this subject is so compelling. It really is about the whole enchilada here.
It is the proverbial enchilada, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, to highlight an example. So, for instance, when we were studying this academically, you take an event like the parting of the Red Sea, right? And you'll get some people who, and this is a good point you're making here, that you'll get some, religious believers who have no problem believing that this interdimensional being known as God or Yahweh or whatever you want to say, uh, yes, absolutely, he, using that pronoun, can
Mm-hmm.
can part these waters, right? No problem there, because that's a spiritual power, right? Um, but they would not believe that ETs could do that, right? They don't consider the possibility that it could be technology that could do this, right? Um, we now talk about terraforming Mars, right, with technology in the future. Again, the point I make to people is that based on the age of the universe, there are some galaxies that would have formed solar systems and planets much sooner than others. So you could have civilizations that are literally like millions, even billions of years older than the time period where human beings kind of came on the scene, kind of thing. And try to imagine where you would get to in your manipulation of reality, even what you see reality as being, comprised of, how much that would change with that additional time. Again, I always make this point. Think about how much our technological landscape and our understanding of reality has changed in 100 years, which is the shortest blink of an eye. Some of these civilizations might have been around for millions of years by the time, they came across the planet Earth and decided to terraform the planet and perhaps even, you know, engineer a species. So the other sort of line of thought that we're taught in academic circles, religious academic circles, is these are stories that are told to convey some sort of truth, not literal truth, but sort of meaningful truth still, right? About redemption and a loving God that cares about people who are being persecuted, that kind of thing. But of course, we're not meant to take it literally, right? That was those poor people who had to make up creation stories and intervention stories because they just didn't know any better. They didn't have a scientific understanding. We were never taught option three, that consider technologically advanced extraterrestrial or interdimensional species coming and interacting with human beings. So it just shows you how much, again, even in these domains that are supposed to be specialist domains, right? These are the experts. How it's pigeonholed into just a couple ideas and the rest is just ignored.
No, yeah, I'm glad we spent some time on that. That was a good rabbit to chase. Well, I guess before we leave that, is there anything else that you wanted to touch on that feels a lot more solid than it may have before?
The last one I'll add, because I probably could go on, but one more I'll add is something like the notion of channeling. You know,
Hmm.
I would say that what I experience now, that's probably as good a term as any other to describe what happens for me in terms of gaining information that seems to come outside, but beyond the parameters of space time as we understand it, that seems to come from some other source. Um, and I think one of the reasons why I would have scoffed at it in the past was because, number one, it hadn't happened to me yet, which of course is usually the biggest factor on whether or not people tend to believe these things or not. Um, but also because when you come from a traditionalist point of view, where you have like a spiritual kind of world, and then you have the material world, right, and never the two shall meet kind of thing. Um, Rather than now, I look at it like my entire perspective on what reality is has changed dramatically, partly through just what I think is the most compelling evidence coming out of neuroscience and physics and evolutionary biology and various domains, different fields of inquiry, but also because of personal experience. And now I see, again, we don't want to get too much into this because this is an entire episode on its own. But when this reality space is more like a dreamscape, a mind space, a field of mentation is what I often call it, then it's not at all difficult to imagine that you have this kind of porous interplay between this reality and other realities and beings that live in those other realities, or some that are sort of cross domain beings, interdimensional, if you want to call them that. That actually you can have a transfer of information. And just like what we talked about, where some things are staring you in the face and you just don't see them, I think in the same way, now I look at it go, and even beyond me, I think channeling happens all the time. I think that, we talked about this in the last episode, everything from great artistic achievements to technological innovation is often coming in this way. But when it arrives in our minds, we just don't think about that as being a possibility in terms of the origin of it. But I think it's happening all the time. And that's fascinating too, in terms of ways that our society, our culture can be being transformed from these external powers that we don't even acknowledge exist.
Mm-hmm. And we talk about this quite a lot, that in our artistic circles, even our religious traditions, we're tapping into this, kind of flow state, or we're, seeking to be, divine vessels, right? These messengers of the divine will in the world that we live in. That's channeling. I mean, it
Right.
is just straight up. And I think, where I think some people may push back on this a little bit, and maybe we can unpack this just a tad here, is this notion that, this, you're kind of saying that this isn't coming from the individual. This isn't something that humans themselves are capable of creating amazing art or music, whatever. It's all coming from somewhere else. And I think our point here is that it's actually a lot more complex than that. We're not saying that that we're kind of putting ourselves on the shelf some over here, and we're just letting some other entity, take the wheel. I'm just going to say that Jesus take the wheel, because this came to mind. It's the common joke about it. But that the way in which we think about reality, this multi-layered, consciousness level, are who we are, is intertwined with all of these other entities that are in the same layer of experience and reality. That there's a deep interplay, in other words, that exists there. Sometimes we just kind of have to turn down one volume knob of our experience to let the other ones come through. But they're all coming from the same, sort of overall channel or station. I think you can explain this a little bit better than I can, but that's the way I think about this. And I just want to make sure we address that, so people don't think we're downplaying, human achievement, and that all human achievement is just some sort of byproduct of letting non-human entities take over.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I would say a couple things before we move on to the next topic. Number one, yes, I would say that something I often say is probably the most overlooked factor in the UFO phenomenon and general paranormality is the complexity of who we are. We focus so much on these others that we don't consider how the complexity of who we are and us being interdimensional beings is part of the process. So, yes, indeed, sometimes I think that something can feel like it's coming from an external source, and it can actually be your higher self. I think that there's truth to even, and I try not to overwhelm people with so many different thoughts that are just so out there. But I think even you can communicate through time with yourself in some ways, because time is ultimately a projection. It's not fundamentally really there. So there's ways around it. In other words, it doesn't have to be linear. But just to get back to what you're saying about the flow state, I mean, many artists and innovators will admit that they themselves had the experience of it just coming to them, almost like it came from an external source. So it's not just like people on the outside are saying, I don't want to give this person credit. I think they got it from somewhere else. They are saying this is their actually lived experience, is they feel like they're channeling it. So yeah, I think but yeah, you make a great point that it is complex, and it's not just about us and this finite body mind and then these other beings in some other dimension. We too are intimate dimensional, and we exist in different domains simultaneously, I would even say, though it gets tricky talking about, terms in time. But nevertheless, information comes to us from outside of our usual conception of the way these things come about.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's a good segue, since you've touched on your own personal experience with this. How has your journey and kind of the revelations and realizations that you've had, like, how have those things really changed you as a person?
Yeah, we were talking about this before we went on the air, and um, it's hard to put that into words in some ways. It's because what happens is it's not just about coming to realizations now. It's about recontextualizing your entire life, right? That things happen that make you, it's sort of like you've seen those movies, right? Where they have this point where, like, I think it was in what, Sixth Sense, right? Where he realizes he's actually been dead the whole time. And they have this
Mm-hmm.
flashback of all these events that have been in the movie. And you see it from that other light now, right? Everything
Mm.
makes sense now that you have this greater realization, this greater context. It's a lot like that. That's what the experience has been for me, is that this strange feeling of not only are things coming to me now, realizations and revelations, but those revelations help me reinterpret my entire life, and events that happened even when I was a very young kid, and I talk sometimes now about how I used to have this quote unquote problem with daydreaming when I was a kid. I would go into these kind of trance states, and at one point, even my parents wondered what was up with that, and there were times where teachers were really concerned about it, and I could see how, again, from a conventional point of view, you're like, "Come on, Darren, dial in. We're learning this right now. Where are you?" And yet, now I look at my experience now, where I go into these states where I kind of channel information. And I think that was happening even when I was a young kid. But of course, I didn't have the language for that. I wasn't brought up in a tradition that had that kind of language. It was just daydreaming, right? Which is very kind of, you know, kind of has a negative connotation. There's nothing good about it, right? And no one was considering that actually could be a way of achieving information, or obtaining information from some extra dimensional source or something. So it's really hard to really capture the just how broad and deep the transformation has been. Sometimes I kind of have to shake my head and step back and say, "Wow, how much has changed over the last few years?" And it really is a tremendous amount of change. And I'm still right in the midst of it. Right? It feels like I was saying to you before we went on the air that when I kind of have these realizations and these revelations, uh, they kind of compound and transcend the last one. So no sooner do I sort of think about how I want to communicate one um, segment of information, that then the next one comes that helps me understand how that made more sense in the larger picture. So it's yeah, I really can't overstate how transformative it's been, while at the same time, and I want to turn it over to you to give some feedback here, because I can understand, to someone who hasn't had these experiences, it sounds increasingly like delusions of grandeur or something. It sounds so outside the norm of what's expected, and uh, even comes close to what we describe as people who are wrestling with mental illness, right? Like how sound is their mind, so to speak. So let me turn it over to you. What's your experience been like? How is it different than mine? And what has it been like for you as my friend over the last year or so, to sort of see this happening to me?
Yeah, great questions. For me, it has been this reignition of belief. And as you were talking, it reminded me of how beliefs that we come to in our life are opportunities that we there they're invitations for us to go in and reinterpret our past. That's just the nature of how belief functions, right? We're excellent at incorporating belief into our and assimilating that into our notion of self. And so for me, it's done a few things. That it's allowed me to believe again in things that I would have once really turned a very cold shoulder to, and that willingness to believe, or at least hold room for belief, has given me a lot more on a personal level than my previous stance of, kind of virulent, agnosticism or atheism in a way toward belief. Um, I like myself better as a person, if I could sum this up, as a believing person, or a person who's willing to believe. I like that kind of person that I am more than I like the person who isn't. Um, and I recognize that to the outsider, particularly in our day, who really wants that solid proof. They have to have data in order to base a belief on it. And if they don't have the data, then the rest is just superstition, it's craziness. And, why would you do that? I understand that point of view. And I've lived many, many years from that perspective. But, for me, this journey has shown in many ways the kind of fallacy of that thinking, because we all have beliefs, whether you look at my beliefs and you say, oh, those are kind of crazy, and I can't believe you would entertain that to be true. I could easily take many of the things that people today commonly believe, and I could examine those and say, are you sure about this? Is this as solid as you think it is? And I think if we do that exercise, we'll find that, belief is prevalent, pretty much everywhere. And it just so happens to be that the more people who believe like we believe, it has the illusion of conviction and truth and reality. And that in and of itself is also a clue that points towards something that we can touch on perhaps later. Um, so it's been an exciting journey for me to kind of go down all these rabbit holes and explore them, and it does in many ways, it has changed the way I look at my past, the way that you describe. I've looked back at the journeys that I've been on and what I've learned and experiences that I've had with people, and I've looked at them with a fresh perspective, and I'm very grateful for that, because it's like meeting a new person, and I think we can get really in a rut quite often. And for me, this has been very exciting to kind of get to know myself again from a different vantage point. Now, when it comes to my journey with you specifically, that has been incredibly interesting, and we joke about this, I think, a good bit. So I'll just point out some of the obvious here, but it's strange that you and I happen to live with mere miles away from each other. That we we have the backgrounds that we do, which, by the way, our academic journeys and our personal journeys don't in any way, shape, or form span our geographic upbringing. We've both lived all over the place, and me more so in the South, but certainly not in any one particular location. We both come from different, sort of subsects of religious tradition of Christianity, and have had different journeys in Christianity, and different teachings. And so, to having traveled all over these terrains, and then kind of landed in the same locale, and then also happened to have been interested in this topic at this time, and then found each other through these virtual mediums that we have. I mean, that's quite remarkable. I'm grateful for that. I don't know. I would like to attribute that to some sort of plan or some sort of guiding hand, and perhaps that is true. I like the idea that it is true. So it's been incredibly enriching just to to be able to be a part of this conversation with you, but witnessing your journey in particular. Someone who has put together and continues to put together so many, cogent, excellent episodes on this topic that I had likened to, kind of a professor of ufology, breaking down all these things in these really easy to digest, formats. To then watching you like come every week with me with just like, okay, you won't believe what's happening now, or like, what I just learned, or you can't talk about this, or it's like there's so many things that I know that's a huge tease to everybody, but they're week in and week out, watching you kind of go through this transformation has been exciting, and at times I think, as you kind of hinted at, like a little bit jarring for me. It's like, because I'm very much this is where we differ in many ways, and I mentioned this to you before we got on tonight, that I kind of feel like I'm like the catastrophe weather reporter who's out there in the middle of the hurricane, and I know there's a hurricane. Like, I know there's a there. I'm in it. I'm listening to people. I have friends who've been through this, and I believe them. But I'm there, giving the report, asking the questions, and trying to transfer this back to the folks who don't have that experience, who aren't there on site, and I'm stuck in between. So it's a little bit weird for me, because I think the desire is there to have an experience. I have found myself many times, and this goes back to even my childhood, growing up in a Christian tradition, yearning for that very visceral experience, for that revelatory moment, and it just not coming. So I don't know what that means. I don't know if it's just how I'm wired, or what have you. But that's the one thing that separates me from, I think, the deeper conviction that you have developed. As your journey has continued, you've had experience upon experience upon experience, and they seem to be growing in frequency and intensity. Whereas for me, my experience is growing in frequency and intensity, but through my relationship with you. So it's just a very different on ramp. But I'm grateful for that. I think that there are a lot of folks that are in my position, that find this topic to be incredibly compelling. As you mentioned earlier, maybe the most important topic of all time. And we always wonder, like, why aren't more people interested in this? But there are a lot of folks that are like me that haven't had an experience, but they see that there's a there. And so, to those folks, I would say, enjoy the journey, and stay on the adventure, and don't force anything. Right. I think it's tempting to get into this trap of like, I just really need an experience, and I'm going to force it no matter what happens. I'm going to consult with so-and-so, and I want the hitchhiker, like, I don't think that that's the right perspective to take. I think, we all have to do this kind of self-care and self-knowledge, and work on those practices every day, and then let what comes come, because that's really the better place to be in. That grounded position is going to best prepare you for whatever may come your way. And I am convinced that as the world around us continues to change, we will be well equipped to deal with that complexity, that new change that enters into our lives, because we've found that calm place in the storm, and we're able to kind of report and report back and get through it in a way that others can identify just by seeing how we approach it. That's a very long answer, but I don't know. It's definitely worth thinking about, and I'm glad we had the conversation.
Yeah, just a couple points I want to add when I reflect on what you were saying there. I think for me, one thing that was really key in being able to embrace these experiences and these revelations is that, like you mentioned in the past, right, when you were in your agnostic or atheist phase, it it was kind of because the two options you were given was, traditionalist religion or, rational scientific understanding, right? Those were the two. And there really wasn't much crossover, right? So it's either, you believe what science as it has been able to empirically demonstrate is true, or you believe a bunch of wishful thinking that some people have grown up with, right? That's what it's sort of, you're left with that kind of on the table. And it's not surprising that you move towards, the scientific, rational. You felt like that was actually based on evidentiary truth, right? Um, but I think for me, what's helped, and I know you've been on this journey too, is realizing that reductionistic materialism, physicalism, is actually an untenable model. So for me, it's very much been that these two pistons have been firing at the same time. That my left brain has been able to say, wait a second, all of this is up for grabs because actually, this notion that there's a physical universe apart from consciousness, and that the idea that consciousness is kind of this derivative of just, you know, matter, stuff, right? And it's not really meaningful, and it's just a brief flurry of cognitive interactions of neurons that are going to die, and then there was nothing to you. Going from that and being convinced that that kind of was the right perspective to suddenly realizing, no, actually, a notion like space time exists within consciousness. That just because something, like I say many times, you can knock on a desk, it can make a sound, you can feel it on your knuckle, that doesn't make it foundationally real any more than when you have that experience in a dream. You get the same sort of sensation. But because we have this shared collective delusion around believing that, again, we've talked in this episode a few times now about this unquestioned inheritance we come up with, right? This is one of the unquestioned inheritances that we all inherit in Western civilization, is this notion that science has proved these things about nature, and yet it hasn't. That's not even what science is in the business of doing. Science is in the business of modeling what nature does, how nature behaves, and we've been able to transform our civilization by way of that predictive power we've gained, right, as a mechanism. But that doesn't tell us what it ultimately is. It just tells us what it does. Any more than a kid playing a video game might, become really good. A 10-year-old can master a game because they play it constantly. They don't really understand what's going on, the computer, the software, the circuitry that's really behind that, right? So for me, it's definitely been a really interesting mix of, on the one hand, recognizing, wait a second, reality is much different than what we've been taught, and I'm having these experiences which made me open to them more because of that marriage with this new understanding of what underpins reality. So, and so even when you brought up the thing about, the synchronicity of us living in the same area with a similar backgrounds, and again, I think if you look at reality more like this projection based on the interaction of like conscious agents, and that it's more like a social network that expresses itself spatially, temporally, but ultimately it's the meaningful connections behind the forms that are ultimately real. And that's been my experience, by the way, in some of these trance states I go into as well. Then suddenly it's not surprising that you and I would end up living in the same place. And it's not superstitious or religious of us to say that there is some sort of meaning behind that. Again, it's the inheritance we sort of take on about what reality is that makes us not be able to see these things in these ways. But once you're open to that, because the model suddenly says, absolutely, this could be the case, then suddenly you start noticing things that you never noticed before, which really speaks to what we're taught, the models we inherit actually really fundamentally change what we see. I've said this before many times, that a worldview transformation is not just about seeing the same things differently. It's about seeing new things. And again, people coming from a physicalist paradigm find that very hard to believe. They're like, come on, we're all living in the same world. And I'm like, we're really not. We're really not. That this field of mentation manifests spatial temporal forms and whatnot, differently. And because you're not in somebody else's head and somebody else's experience, you just don't see it that way. And because there's so much cohesion around a consensus reality in Western civilization, it rarely gets questioned. But that's exactly why, if you go to a developing country or something, or you go to visit a shamanic culture, you actually see different things happen. And that's because the consensus reality is different, I would suggest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was reminded of a recent episode on with Kurt J. Mongol on his Theories of Everything podcast with Ian McGilchrist and I think it was John Vervaeke, and they were talking about the meaning crisis. And I think you and I have touched on this quite a bit, and some of that meaning crisis is directly connected to the materialist perspective. It's not a coincidence that atomizing everything, mechanizing everything, from the particles that make up matter to our organs to our individual selves, to this emphasis on our own unique perspective, above and over every other person's unique perspective, this radical individualism. Like, it's not a surprise that that thinking literally has an impact on how we perceive the world, how we derive meaning from that experience, and so many other things. Now to take a different view and to say, well, no, actually, we are all connected. We are all part of this same substrate, that to look at the world and look for those connections radically changes how you behave, how you think, how you experience. And to me, that is this profound. We're talking about things that have changed us. This realization has changed me and has redeemed my lived experience. It has allowed me to be more connected to those in my life and to those who I have not ever met. Because even though I've not met them, I believe I am connected with them. So imagine that perspective if we all took a perspective like it. The way we would interact with one another, the things we would be looking for in terms of knowledge, understanding, insight, all of that would be transformed. And I know that sounds very, sort of new agey, but quite frankly, like, that's been my experience, and if you look for those kinds of things to be true and to manifest in your own experience, it turns out you'll find them. And I think anyone that's had a synchronistic moment, whether they've been chasing this topic or any other important decision in their life, which is usually where these things happen to appear, interestingly enough, you come away from those experiences with that little glimpse of the religious epiphany. We don't want to call it that, but that's kind of what it is, and that's how we would describe it. So I would encourage folks to kind of follow that, take that on, and see if they can implement that into their life. There are lots of different things that they can do to, I think, put that into practice. And it is a practice. And quite frankly, it's a hard one, because every day you're going to be practicing that way of thinking in opposition to the counter prevailing narrative that we've all been born into. And it's really tough.
Yeah, as you were talking there, I had a bunch of epiphanies coming to me around, things that have changed over the last couple of years. And I liked what you talked about there in terms of, when we say something like religious epiphany, immediately people hear the word religious and they go, I'm not interested in that. That's old mumbo jumbo. But again, one thing that you and I keep on about on this podcast is try to separate an experience or an event or phenomena from the interpretation of it, from the baggage that's been associated with it. I know that I said to you after this really mind-blowing experience I had, I think just before our last episode, so 2 weeks ago, I said to you, it was the closest thing I've had to a full-blown religious experience. And by that, I didn't mean, it followed a dogmatic, religious tradition. I meant that it was this I was referring to the level of impact, right? It was so transformative, and it was so spoke so much to the core of my being and who I was, and revelations beyond this lifetime, even, right? And how else can you describe it? And and what's ironic is in our religious traditions, for instance, in the traditions that you and I were in, again, some are more open to new experiences than others, but a lot of it has been reduced to just referring to events that used to happen to people thousands of years ago, um, rather than seeing that these same interdimensional non-human intelligences that were interacting with people then still are. Um, and that when that kind of thing happens, it can be just as transformative and mind blowing as the experiences that they had as well. And I would say it's amazing when I look back and realize now I've become great friends with people all around the world. You could say because of my podcast, because they reached out to me, but often because they have had this sense that something's telling them, right? Reach out to this person. You're connected to this person somehow. That there's this larger orchestration going on behind the scenes. That all I'm doing is going with what I feel led to do, right? And the part that I play. And what looks clear when you sort of step back is that there's some sort of orchestration going on, even amongst people around the world, by some sort of intelligence that is beyond what we usually consider as possible in our mainstream conventional Western understanding. And to feel a part of that, when you talked about the meaning crisis, right, in our civilization, which is so true, so true. Um, to on the contrary to that, to feel like you're a part of something, some movement that is not just like full of woo and exciting spectacles in the sky, but is actually leading towards a way to sort of model a different way of being human, a different way of being a community of human beings. That gets really exciting, and that makes you just excited to be alive in this time, here and now, and a part of something that's bigger than all of us. That's how I feel when I look back on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. And that we're connected to our listeners. We're connected to folks that we may never meet in person, and I would say too, more broadly, we can kind of get caught in the trap of confusing our intense focus on this topic for kind of what's happening everywhere, right? And forgetting that what's happening everywhere is much broader and deeper than our narrow focus here. I think that you and I would agree that our focus on this topic is allowing us to glean these important insights into what's happening everywhere. But that's not to say that there are grander movements at play that are bigger in so many ways than just the UFO issue or the UAP or phenomenal experience or what have you. And as we kind of talked about earlier in the show, I mean, just look to human history, and you'll see what the grander things are at play. And not everything has been rosy either. I don't want to sort of paint the picture that we're on this unbroken line of progress that has not encountered some setbacks. I mean, we very clearly have had many periods in our history that have been fraught with wrong turns and regressions and all those kinds of things. But the impetus, the urge to move this forward, I don't think that comes from some sort of other being. It comes from consciousness itself, right? Just so happens that other beings also have that same source, right? So they are prodding us along. And some of them may not be as well, but the overall kind of broad sweeping movement is a movement of conscious expression. Is this urge to kind of see intelligence connect and intertwine and create and push us forward. And I feel like we've entered the phase of this show this evening that sounds quite spiritual, and we're painting in very broad strokes. But I'm hoping that folks can understand that this last few minutes that we've been talking, like this has impacted us in a very deep way, and it has changed the way in which we look at our own lives, but also human history and the world as it is today.
Yeah, and it's a good point. We can. I think both of us kind of sometimes lean towards sort of like the picture of the caricature of the pipe smoking professor who likes to sit back and observe things, in kind of a stoic way, 30,000 foot view, and it is something that's true for both of us. But I think sometimes that kind of stoicism can be a result of feeling divorced from feeling alive, from feeling like anything of real impact can actually happen. So you sort of settle for this kind of stoic kind of arm's length perspective on analysis. And what's been so interesting for me in this process has been, when you talked about me doing these in-depth analyses on different podcast episodes and point of convergence, that it's very much been, again, a dual piston kind of thing. I feel like I've been led to investigate certain topics within the broad sphere of the UFO phenomenon. And then revelations arise in that process that is much more than just what I can come up with by far. I had no idea that was going to happen to begin with. And the other thing I want to say too, and I because you made this point, and I always want to make this point, this caveat, because I don't want people to come away from these conversations thinking that the only intelligences that are here are these super moral, hyper advanced, here to take care of the daycare kids who have lost their way. Just like with humanity, just like wandering into the jungle, it's complex. It's not simple. It's not necessarily always safe, any more than life is. I think before we went on the air, I was saying to you that I see at least 3 different kinds of experiences that people have. There are some people like myself who've been fortunate enough to be in contact with benevolent groups and intelligences that seem to be working towards some greater good. There are other groups that seem to be much more self-serving. Now, that doesn't mean they're necessarily evil in the terms of like a demonic kind of characterization of just nothing but, darkness, but more like an immaturity and kind of a self-serving that, touching on what you said, they haven't yet had that non-dual realization that they are part of the bedrock of consciousness, and that by hurting us, they're hurting themselves. All conscious agents need to go through that progression. Some of them have not yet, even when they have advanced technology. Advanced technology does not necessarily equate to advanced morality or a non-dual understanding of consciousness. So that's another group. And there's also a kind, which I think sort of fits more with the podcast episode I did this last week on point of convergence, where if you have a really finite, fixed sense of self as being this individual who's been alive for a few decades and has this history, came from these parents, grew up in this place, and you're really fixed on that identity, then sometimes these experiences with these other intelligences are so mind-bending, so personality expanding, right? They quickly dissolve those false borders. They show them for what they really are. But in that process, it can feel like a Kundalini like breakdown, basically, where it can feel like you're dying because your fixed sense of self literally does get challenged and transcended in that process. And that itself can feel completely overwhelming, along with all the ontological shock of coming into contact with beings that people have been told should not exist, cannot exist. So there's at least those 3 different kinds of things going on. And that's still very broad strokes. It's very, very complex. But, we just want to bring this to people's attention because this is complex, and because there are many different groups, even from different origin sources, within what we, conveniently call the UFO phenomenon, we have to remember that one person's experience is not the same as another's. And I know that we often talk about this, but if someone's had a great experience, don't dismiss it. Don't try and tell them it's wishful thinking. Don't tell them they're being deceived by beings that like are out to fool them. Likewise, if people have had a negative experience that really traumatic things have happened, people who have had, babies taken from them, impregnation of women who then have had babies taken, and it impacts them physiologically and whatnot. Don't dismiss that. Don't belittle that. Don't tell them that they're just imagining it, that there can't be such thing as a negative non-human intelligence. Yes, there can be. Again, not so much evil, but just immature on that same sort of spiral of development like all of us. So I just want to offer that caveat that just because my experience has been positive doesn't mean I don't recognize that other people's has not necessarily been the same.
Mm-hmm. It's just so important to meet people where they are and to listen first and apply your perspective second, because most of the time people just are looking for someone to listen, to hear them out and to see them as a person, not to jump in and moralize or overlay their own another interpretation. Be a good conversation partner. Well, I as we kind of get toward the end of the episode, I'll throw this question out there. We may not spend a lot of time on it, but kind of where you are now, and the way you're looking at things. Are there any kind of areas that you're looking for greater clarity? Is there anything that you think would be really beneficial to help complete the picture that we currently have, or that you currently have? We'll be more specific, of what you think is going on that would add to your insights. Something that, it's hard to necessarily identify that which we don't yet know, but there's just something you feel like would be great if you could shore that up a little bit.
It's a good question because of the complexity that I just described. It's difficult to know the full trajectory, to have this sense of where it's all leading. Because again, I can have a very strong conviction about an experience that I'm having and something I feel led to do. But, there are other groups that have different intentions. When we talk about, this ramping up that seems to be happening, when you take a look at something like, UFOs showing up over nuclear facilities, for instance, again, just like we talked about in religious tradition, people are very dogmatic in their perspectives on that. I don't hear that many people saying, listen, you could equally see that as a positive or as a negative, right? You usually get people saying, clearly they're showing up to say, listen, you fools, don't play around with this energy. You're splitting the very substance of reality. When you split the atom and releasing these destructive forces that impact even interdimensional domains and whatnot. Sure, that's a valid interpretation. But you'll get other people who say just as adamantly, these guys are scoping us out. They're checking our weapon systems. They're making sure that they can disable them when they need to, in preparation for some sort of domination over us or something. And you have to be honest that apart from my own personal experience, for instance, you just look at that on the face of it, and those are both sort of equally valid possibilities in terms of gathering intelligence. And so I certainly feel like I have a sense of what I'm in contact with and where that's going. But where that fits into the big picture is a different question, and I know that I've discussed with you before, and I even got a chance to talk to Ken Wilber about it a while back in Denver. And that is that just because we've so far, had new worldviews come online, we've seen consciousness move forward with humanity, that's no guarantee that it will always move forward. You can have a regression. We've seen some of that in our American society, but you can actually just have the whole thing blow up, right? And what's amazing or telling in kind of a sobering way is that when you listen to experiencer accounts again, a lot of these non-human intelligences are saying that many civilizations who get to our point actually don't end well. That this toxic mix between a high technological capacity with a low level of consciousness doesn't mix well. And we could probably, between the two of us, name 5 or 6 ways that we're destroying ourselves as a civilization as we speak. So that's something that I definitely would love clarity on is how all this is going to play out in terms of these different groups that are all simultaneously here with different agendas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree to that for sure. And to add to that, I would love, like many of our listeners would, I'm sure, to know more about our own government's explicit relationship um, with this topic. I'm just as curious about the crash retrievals, the technology, the different beings, the learnings and the experiments that we've conducted to try to understand what this is. If nothing else, but to also, I think, bring into greater focus uh, the lenses in which our leadership has approached this topic over time. You know, I would hope that our listeners um, would be well equipped, right? With any new sort of revelatory um, disclosure that we might see, that we can look at that and go, oh, okay, like I see why we may have done that, or I'm seeing that the reason they did that was because they interpreted it like this, and that interpretation is grounded in this perspective. Because I think we could, if we weren't constantly trying to reinforce this, sort of multi-perspectival methodology that we like to lean into, that it would be very easy for us to get these learnings and be like, well, that makes sense to me now, and I guess they really are demons. Like, I mean, that would be like my biggest letdown is like, fans of our show would hear somebody, the president or someone, say like, we kept this from you because it turns out they were demons, and our folks are just like, well, I knew it the whole time. I mean, that I would just be like, well, we missed it somewhere. We didn't do our job. So, I don't know what you think about that, though.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a huge question too. Is that, and this ties us back to the very beginning of this conversation. There's data and there's interpretation of data, and um, you know, whoever happens to be in power at the time that this disclosure actually happens on a more widespread scale, they have the privileged position of also shaping the narrative, right? Not saying this is the raw phenomena, because that's not what most people want. Most people want you to tell them what it is, what it means, right? What are the implications? How is this going to change my life? And so that also is that's, is that an accident of history? Is it being planned as well? That's going to be an interesting point in time to look back on, that whoever is in power at that time that has that responsibility to try and shape this, describe it, and pass it on to the masses. That's a heavy burden to carry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, I've enjoyed this conversation very much. It's one of those times where no matter how much planning we do before we get on to do the show, when we actually do the show and walk through the topics that we intended to cover, I have these kinds of moments where, we've kind of talked about this in private before, where it feels as if we've had this conversation before. Or even, I will say this, and this is speaking to what I said earlier with this, perspective of that we're all connected. There are many times in our conversation where I feel part of what you were saying, like connected to what you were saying, as if I am saying it. Um, that these kinds of things blend together, and
Right.
and at the same time that I'm thinking about our listeners as well, and like I would, you know, try to put myself into their shoes and understand what they're hearing. So, um, It's been a real pleasure, and I want to wish you well on this coming weekend. Although by the time this airs, it will already have concluded.
That's right.
But maybe just like those psi experiments, I'm going to say it was a smashing success, and it no doubt will be. Um, and I look forward to listening to it and hearing all about the encounters that you have with so many people that we have had the pleasure of interacting with virtually, and you'll get to meet in person.
Yeah, and I'll just quickly add before we sign off here that for all the valid concerns people have about social media, it's been a pretty amazing mechanism to connect all these people, and that we're all going to meet in person. And there's a real affection that's formed around this community, and it's going to be living, breathing in 3D this upcoming weekend. And hopefully, that's just the beginning of many, many more.
I know it will be. I know it will be. Well, thank you for listening and for tuning in. As we close, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.